one or two more minutes here.
Oh, I can see the numbers there. I'm sure you do as well, yes.
For those of you just joining in, we're waiting just one, two more minutes before starting the event and opening it up, as we have a great number of people joining. So we just want to make sure that we have a good quorum before beginning. So. Great. So let me welcome all of you and introduce myself and introduce this event. I'm Travis Zadeh, the director of Yale's program in Iranian Studies. This is a roundtable discussion on the ongoing protests in Iran. It is truly an honor to host this conversation and to welcome you to what I know will be a very stimulating discussion. First, I should note that this event could have only been made possible and at such short notice through the support of Yale's Macmillan Center. Particular thanks goes to Marwa Kabur, the program director for Yale's Council on Middle East Studies, Kristen Siebert, program director for African and Middle East Studies, and Marjan Wardaki, postdoctoral associate for Yale's program in Iranian Studies. We are joined this evening by Manijeh Moradian, assistant professor at Barnard College in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, Siamdoust, assistant professor at the University of Texas, Austin in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, Naghmeh Sohrabi, professor of Middle East History and the director for research at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University, and Nayereh Tohidi, professor emerita and former chair of Gender and Women's Studies and founding director of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at California State University, Northridge. Finally, we've been honored to be joined here by Abbas Amanat, Professor Emeritus of History at Yale University, who has kindly agreed to moderate today's discussion and to open with some introductory remarks. Each discussant will speak for about 10 minutes. This will then be followed by a general conversation, which Professor Amanat will moderate between the discussants. We will then move to an open set of questions and answers with you, the audience. Feel free to post any questions you might have along the way in the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of your screen. We hope to run for about 75 minutes or so into an hour and a half. I also wanted to note that this event we'll be recording this event and we'll be posting it online should you wish to share it with others afterwards. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Amanat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Travis. Welcome our viewers and our panelists. This is a very unique occasion, it seems to me, because we are, in a sense, addressing and commenting issues that is going on right now. So from day to day, from hour to hour, things may change. But we thought, I think Travis and to some extent myself, and I presume our panelists would think that this is such a critical moment, and the nature of this movement is as such. I would call it a movement, perhaps we should call it a protest movement, is as such that it definitely deserves a great deal of attention, not only from the media outside Iran, now it seems inside Iran as well, but also from our community, from the academics who have for long engaged in one way or another with many of the aspects that this movement represents. Perhaps the most significant of it is the presence of a large number of younger women, or in general, we can say a younger generation of men and women in the streets of Tehran or in the streets of all the large and small cities and even small towns in Iran. So there's several interesting characteristics to it. One is that it's nationwide. The other one that it represents a kind of a break, generational in a sense, that we have this new generation of young people. And the third one, which I found it very fascinating, is that among the many of the protesters, we find many who in their appearance at least seem to be more kind of belonging to the traditional classes in the society. They are wearing a hijab. And it seems that this diversity is very well has been taken by the protesters themselves, which I think is a sign, in my opinion at least, a certain degree of maturity that we see in this generation. I'm sure we are going to hear a great deal more about this from our panelists. So we thought between ourselves that perhaps it would be better if we would, instead of going in alphabetical order, which is normally the case, in some kind of a thematic order. Perhaps first we would have Dr. Nahid Siamdoust, who may want to give us some kind of an overall picture, talk about the generalities. Then we would have Naghmeh, Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi, who might, we may have Dr. Nayereh Tohidi, who might want to give us some idea about the characteristics of this protest movement. And then we may have Dr. Manijeh Moradian to give us some, perhaps a kind of a, if you like, more theoretical perspective to what we are witnessing around us. And finally, we would have Naghmeh Sohrabi, Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi, who is going to talk more from the perspective of some of the insiders who are experiencing more closely from within rather than us from without. And then of course there will be a time for the panelists, as Dr. Zadeh pointed out, between the panelists, and then perhaps I would interject, and then eventually there is going to be a time for questions from the people who are viewing this webinar. Saying all of this, I would like to turn now to Dr. Siamdoust to give us the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zadeh and Dr. Amanat and Ms. Khabour and Dr. Wardaki for having us here tonight. Thank you to you all for being here for this discussion. If I may just be allowed to share my screen. And while that's happening, I can tell you basically what I'm going to be doing in the next 10 minutes is sort of, this movement, the Zan Zendegi Azadi movement has been a very iconic movement. There's been lots of cultural production, lots of, in terms of videos, songs, poster art. And so what I'm going to do is run us through some of these iconic images, though I'm not focusing specifically on the art. I'm actually taking us through some of the news images that really sort of propelled this movement forward, and hoping that through a discussion of them, I can highlight the different issues that have been seminal in these protests. So let me just share my screen here. And here we go. Please let me know if you're able to see my screen. Yes. So I think if we were to place a sort of start date on these recent the protest movement, I would actually put it way back in July of 2022, just this summer, when Sepideh Rashno was brought to television to do a sort of forced apology and confession, and sort of really ask for apology to her counterpart, who they had an altercation on the bus. Sepideh Rashno was filming a situation in which the woman who you see in the chador was telling another woman to keep her hijab on. Her name is Nayereh Rabi'i, and as we know now, she's connected to the Islamic Republic government. And in this scene that we saw, in this leaked video that went viral on social media, she says, "I'm going to have you arrested by the Sepah." And lo and behold, not long after, we saw Sapideh Rashno, this vibrant sort of, young Iranian woman writer, visibly hurting and visibly just, as others have written on social media, having some signs of torture or some kind of abuse, basically apologizing. And subsequent to this event on social media, we've heard others comment on how this was really sort of the point of ignition that led to Mahsa Amini's, the protest that followed Mahsa Amini's death. On August 15th, after these, the Sapideh Rashno confessions online, President Raisi issued a decree to enforce harsher restrictions on hijab. It was given a name. It was called the Decree on Hijab and Modesty, and basically issued several fines that would be applied to both government workers who would on social media appear outside of the imposed modesty framework of the Islamic Republic. So we're not talking about government workers who are appearing to their work without hijab. We're talking about the way they represent themselves on social media. And I'll come back to why this is important. And other fines for other people appearing in the public space, because a reality that we don't really see in the West is that over the course of the last year or more, especially in well-to-do areas of Tehran, in high-end restaurants and in busy squares, women had long sort of started to let their headscarves slip to their shoulders, and visibly we were seeing many more women sort of uncovered across Tehran. The next, iconic photograph I have, of course, is of Mahsa Amini, who was killed in Morality police detention on the 16th of September. We all know what happened. And what's important about this image that's been reproduced over and over again is that Mahsa Amini was actually impeccably dressed as far as her hijab is concerned, given the current fashions and hijab presentations in Tehran today. And this is something that her parents had brought up. And this is important because it really pointed to the fact that, she was a Kurd coming to Tehran, dressed as she was with a long black veil, long coat, and yet she got into trouble with the morality police with a tragic end, as we know, while other well-to-do women in northern parts of Tehran, including many of the children and wives of government officials or relations of government officials who are able to afford to live in the better parts of Tehran, have much less impeccable hijabs. And this became sort of an important discourse in the protests as well. I'm sorry if I'm going to be sort of going through these images quite quickly, just to sort of run us through these moments. Now, Jina's gravestone, her Kurdish background came to be quite important for these protests, not only for furnishing this movement with the slogan that best encapsulated what it represented, Jin, Jian, Azadi, but also for the way in which it brought Iran's repressed minorities, the Kurds, the Baluchis, the Arabs into the fold. Also the Azaris, but the Azaris are a very significant, prominent segment of Iran's population and not as repressed as these other three large minorities that I just mentioned. And so the protest, through her persona, through her Kurdish background, really became this intersectional protest that involved a lot of different segments of Iran's population. And the protest slogan, of course, itself signaled that liberty for all would remain, liberty for all Iranians would remain at large for as long as liberty was not provided for women, for as long as women didn't have liberty. And so it really encapsulated this, 100-year-long struggle or more that we've seen in Iran for women to achieve that kind of liberation. Now, one of the iconic first photographs was from September 19th, 3 days after Mahsa Amini was killed. We see this very large sort of, it was one of the first photos showing us the magnitude of these protests in Tehran and the standoff between security forces and the people. This was to foretell a defiance and anger against security forces that we hadn't really witnessed to this extent before. And images kept pouring forth in the weeks that followed of these sort of face-to-face encounters and protesters really not backing down. Headscarf bonfires. This was one of the early images of one such headscarf bonfire. This became one of the marking sort of feature of these protests. And this one in particular caught the public imagination. I'm just going to play a short clip before I continue. This one in particular took place in Sari. The woman who triumphantly throws her headscarf into the bonfire was given various names, the fairy of Sari and the fire dancing gypsy. But what was important was that women were coming forth to claim control over their bodies and the way that they would represent their bodies in these headscarf bonfires. And I write about this a little bit in a piece that I have this past week in New Lines magazine about how protesters had been, of course, rehearsing these very scenes for a very long time, whether it's through the Charshambe Suri or the micro sort of videos that have been circulated on social media of women doing dances in the public sphere. This was really the presentation, the performance of something that had been rehearsed already for a long time, not just in the public space, but also on social media, and hence the state's sensitivity toward representations on social media. And then, of course, the anthem of this protest movement. We all know Shervin Hajipour's Baraye song. By now, everybody in the world knows this song. It's been intoned not just in all cities across Iran and is still sort of played from rooftops and balconies and cars, and people are singing along. It's also been played all over the world, and there have been various performances of this very song. No other movement, to my knowledge, has had this sort of, at least within the Iranian context, is what I'm talking about, of course, has had this kind of singular protest anthem. And I think that's for various reasons. This is a leaderless movement. It's a networked movement. It's a movement that has arisen from activity and activism and performances on social media, in part on social media. And this song very much reflects that. The song's lyrics are based on a Twitter feed, Twitter hashtag Baraye, for or because of, where Iranians have come forth to really post what they're standing for and what is at stake for them and why they are here. And it's the reason I believe it's been so effective is because it's actually quite specific. It's very specific to the Iranian experience over the last 10 years or so. It's very specific of political events, of everyday mundane experiences that Iranians have had. And so it has really spoken to people because it has come from the people. So Shervin Hajipour has beautifully vocalized this song, but it was not written by him. It was written by Iranians, sort of a cross-section of the Iranian population. The first few lines, I think, sort of, tell us what the song also, in terms of the mood, refers to, right? The kinds of daily restrictions that Iranians have put up with and that they're now rising up against. I just have a few lines for us to listen to. برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم خواهرت خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی. And this zindagi mamuli, just the yearning for an ordinary life, is what was highlighted in the publication of this photograph taken by Dunya Rad. In this photograph, she's on the right. She posted a photo of her and her friend eating breakfast in Naziabad, so a southern part of Tehran, which is really significant for the circulation of this photo and the kinds of discourses that it engaged with, because as I said, in the more affluent parts of Tehran, being able to take off your headscarf was already a fact of life for those who were able to afford it. And of course, many of them having some kind of hand in or relations with government officials or institutions. And this is really the most ordinary picture. And in its very ordinariness, it is also shocking, because although it's super ordinary, it is sort of an unachievable, improbable image to behold in Tehran, right? Especially in the south of Tehran, in Naziabad, for two women to just sit there and have kelle pache together. And I think that's why this photo became so resonant. And unfortunately, the photographer is still under arrest. She was arrested a couple of days after she published this photo on social media. Another iconic photograph of the resoluteness of the daughter who's standing by the grave of her mother, who was killed, Amina Majidi, who was killed in Kermanshah on the 20th of September. The photo and the funeral happened about a week after she was actually killed, because the government's been holding on to bodies and not readily returning them to their loved ones. And so what we see here, the grief represented and demonstrated through the shorn hair, in a symbolic gesture that dramatically exhibits both the grief and the defiance of the moment, reaching deep into Iranian culture, as cutting hair is already represented as a symbolic act of grief in the Shahnameh. But it was really an act that, sort of a mimetic act that could be copied around, and that has been copied both all over Iran and all over the world, where people have shown their solidarity by engaging very much in this Iranian tradition that has now been called forth to speak to the current moment. And then, of course, more recently, something that Dr. Amanat referred to, the appearance of very young schoolgirls engaging in very defined acts, not just exhibiting their complete lack of respect toward the supreme leader, but also calling for school officials to leave the schoolyard, attacking speakers who have been brought from the Basij, and going into the streets and calling, chanting the most radical protest slogans. And the canonization of now a series of martyrs who are very young, and their graffitis on the walls, 16, 17-year-olds. And, this is something, the representation and the presentation and the presence of the Gen Z, of Iran's Gen Z, is what many have referred to as being the defining difference of this movement. This is a generation that has grown up entirely with social media, that has grown up completely connected to the world, not beholden to discourses of indebtedness to the martyrs and other discourses of fighting imperialism and whatever it is that the Islamic Republic uses in its classrooms. Some of them valid, others really used for ideological and political purposes. A generation that's come of age, connected to the world, and unwilling to submit to what they see as an ideology that masks a very corrupt functioning within, that allows certain people, those people connected to the top, to live free lives, but those who are subjected to it to live very restricted lives according to those imposed discourses. And to end, I just want to really close with a video montage of Sarina Esmailzadeh, the 16-year-old who was killed in the protests. And she had started, as of January this year, to be a video blogger, a vlogger. And so we have a lot of footage of her, actually. You see her in the middle picture, top row, middle picture. We have a lot of video footage of Sarina narrating her life and what it means to be a 16-year-old in Iran. And so I will, in giving the last words to her and her voice, and in honoring her and the lives of all the people who've died in these protests, especially the very young who've gone out and risked their lives and paid with their lives, I'd like to close with the video montage of Sarina speaking about her life.
My lover's got humor. He's the giggle at a funeral. Knows everybody's disapproval. I should.
یه نوجوان 16 ساله چی نیاز دارد؟ به محبت کردن، محبت دیدن، دوست داشته شدن و دوست داشتن نیاز دارد. ما نیازمند شادی، تفریح، نیازمند یه روحیه خوب، یه وایب خوب، انرژی خوب. همه اینا نیازمند چی هن؟ آزادی. اینجا بحثمون یکم دارک میشه. چرا؟ چون یه سری محدودیت هایی که مخصوصا واسه زنها خیلی بیشتر، مثل حجاب اجباری یا خیلی خیلی ممنوعیت هایی که واسه پسرها نیست. مثلا ما حتی یه استودیو نمیتونیم بدیم که اینا همه ما مواجه شدیم، درد سراشو تک تک چشیدیم. شاید تو بیشتر، من کمتر، یا من بیشتر تو کمتر، اما هممون میدونیم که ایران چه وضعیتی داره. مردم یک کشور چه انتظاری میتونن داشته باشن از کشور خودشون؟ رفاه، 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 نه چیز دیگه ای. خب وضعیت اقتصادیمون که داغونه، فرهنگیمون داغونه، اصالتمون داغونه.
Take me to church, I worship like a dog at the shrine of the light. Tell you my sins and you can sharpen your knife. Offer me that death instead. Good God, let me give you my life. Take me.
دیگه این الان 20 سال پیش نیستش که ما جز دو جوانه همسن خودمون تو ایران هیچ کس دیگه ایران ندیده باشیم. نه، ما اون کسی که تو اتیوپی داره از گرسنگی میمیره رو هم دیدیم. اونی هم که برای تو اله عشق خودش هم میکنه رو دیدیم. و خب اونجایی هم که انسان کمالگراست همیشه به اون خوبه نگاه کنه و میخواد بشه اون خوبه.
آزادی is looting.
چه حسی بهتر از این حس که رها و آزاد میشه؟
Stop share.
Well, thank you very much, Nahid, for this extremely moving and at the same time very informative introduction. It took a little bit longer than what it's supposed to be in our panel, but I think it was very worthwhile. So thank you very much for that, and raises a lot of questions about the people who are actually protesting and what kind of a generation gap that we are witnessing. So next, we are moving to Nayereh, Dr. Nayereh Tohidi, who is going to present more about the characteristics of the movement, or some of the characteristics of the movement. Dr. Tohidi, please.
Yes, thank you. And greetings to everyone. And thank you, Dr. Travis Zadeh and Dr. Amanat and of course, Ms. Marwa and her team for organizing this very timely event. I think Nahid very beautifully said a lot of things I wanted to say about just some basic characteristics, but I will now try to elaborate a little bit more analysis, perhaps, about first find my, okay, I'm trying to use my notes, but not necessarily. As far as I understand, and our understanding, at least mine, is still very tentative and not completely sure and firm, but based on what we know so far, and based on what we have seen so far, to me, it seems obviously a turning point in Iran's politics and political culture, and especially gender politics. And I see this not reversible, meaning things are going to be not the same after this, regardless of what happens to this movement. We still don't know exactly what we call it sociologically. Those who study social movements are talking about protest movement, or they're talking about some talking about youth rebellion, and led by younger women, because half of the youth is, after all, female. And some talk about a feminist movement, a feminist revolution, actually. So these are all can be potentially true. But what I see is a widespread, a nationwide expression of outrage, anger, frustration, and especially by the younger generations. And I see a yearning for dignity, for recognition, hormat, respect, because those who are engaged now in this continuous protest are usually the ones who have a common pain, common experience of being humiliated, being assaulted physically, verbally, by this patriarchal theocracy. I emphasize patriarchy because this patriarchy is has not only been harassing and controlling women and women's body and violating their bodily autonomy, but this patriarchy, especially this older ruling group, have been dominating, controlling, especially the youth, not letting them to live normal youth life as the young persons do in different countries, and also not humiliating even other men, because this is like the grand patriarch that is intervening in the most private affairs of the gender dynamics within a family. In front of, say, husband or brother or father, they come and attack their daughters or wives and saying that you haven't covered yourself properly. So it not only challenges the man, the dignity of that man who thinks that as if, I'm here, nobody, and they are going to be disrespectful to my wife, daughter, sister, and I can't do anything about it. And so it is just a sense of frustration and pent up, anger throughout these 40 some years that was as if, this death of a Kurdish woman whose Kurdishness, ethnicity matters given the context in Iran and intersects with her gender identity. So this brings not only the anger of the youth and women, but also connects to the ethnic issues in Iran. Therefore, we see intersection of several factors here. Intersection of gender issues, women's rights with the youth, the issues that are more particular to the younger generations. So generational factor is really important. I will talk about it more later. And also intersection with ethnicity, with religious minorities who also have been humiliated, to be asked, especially women members, to be asked to wear the Islamic hijab, regardless of respect for their own community autonomy. Even this is against the constitution of this present regime that allows ethnic groups and minorities, religious minorities, go based on their own culture and belief system, but that they have since, especially, I believe it was a few years after the legalization, when they made compulsory veiling legal, they also went after the religious minorities and forced them to observe that dress code. So therefore, there are lots of intertwinement here of different groups who share this outrage, who share this yearning for dignity, for taking back their lives. As Nahid mentioned, that is very powerful, important aspect of this movement. When your life is out of your control and you realize that you are fed up with that and you want to take it back, your sovereignty, your autonomy, that becomes a powerful motivation. So it is, for the most part, I think, has a very feminist and women-oriented characteristics, this movement. This was something that many of us advocates of women's rights have been dreaming to see, that one day all women rise up, or more women rise up and just say, enough is enough. Leave me alone, leave my body alone, let me have my own choice, my own agency. So in this sense, this has been very unprecedented protest movement, because not only women and issues of women were the main reason for eruption of the protests, but also women are leading it and men alongside with them. This is unprecedented in Iranian history, in the MENA region's history. And 3 weeks ago, in an interview with BBC, I dared to say, even in the world, this is unprecedented. But I wasn't later, I was saying, Nayereh, why did you say that? You haven't done your studies yet. But now I see that last night I was reading an article by Robin Wrights in the New Yorker, and she interviewed a few scholars. They are saying the same thing. Because there have been in Iranian history, of course, a lot of women's participation in different movements. Women have been always active, beginning from the Tambaku uprising, constitutional movement, the Green movement, the 1979 revolution. Women have been everywhere in the, and alongside with men demonstrating. And of course, most of the time during the 1979 and later, they had to be behind men. But this time, they are not demonstrating just for to take part in a social movement. They're demonstrating for their own causes, for gender-based causes. And men are accepting that. And the slogan, that's exactly why the slogan, women, life, freedom, becomes so telling and so important and so refreshing. Because for the first time, it shows that many people in Iran too have the right to even risk their lives for social issues, not just economic issues. Because there is a tendency among some of us on the left that we think that everything, if the cause of the protest is not economic, then it's not really important. Or it is the bourgeoisie or the upper middle class who are talking about this. No, the class basis of these people really vary. It includes middle class, lower middle class, and the increasingly poor middle class, or the middle class poor. And I would say that one of the reasons why the youth are so hopeless now is that many of their parents who are middle class have become so poor. And therefore, these young men and women don't see any future for themselves, career-wise, being able to go to study abroad. They cannot afford it any longer. So they have joined also by some poorer people. Now we see even in Naziabad, Yaftabad, in the very poor districts of Tehran, the demonstrators are joining. And of course, again, because the youth had, especially this generation of Z generation, as Nahid mentioned, and there has been good writings about this Z generation, they are very much globalized. They are very much connected to the world and exposed to progressive ideas. They have understood and have become very conscious about the importance of their privacy, because now the number of children in the families are only like 2 or 1. So they have the opportunity to have their private life, their own room, and their own experience of learning about, the private boundaries and so forth. So these are the generations that are not going to accept to be assaulted, physically humiliated. So they're fearless. They have learned a lot of things from the internet that our generation have not. So they're a different group of people. And of course, in part, they are the ones who have radicalized this protest movement so fast. Some people are worried that it got too radical too fast, but that is in the nature of the youth. And also they have been fed up. And the women especially, and their parents too, after trying everything, voting, reform, believing the reformers and counting on the something good may come up after electing this reformer, that reformer who's more moderate than the extreme ones. Nothing has worked. Things have got worse, especially after the election of Raisi. That is another thing that has sparked, that has made people ready to, to exploit, because to explore to show outrage, especially since Raisi, the extent of repression and control have increased. And so they saw no hope, and that's what they're saying, enough is enough. We don't want Islamic Republic, down to the dictator. And I think they are right. I don't think that, even the reformers are so in such a sad situation now, because some of them think that if they were reformers, they have to be reformers all the time. No, you don't. When reform doesn't work and you tried it several times, then move on, take another approach. But they are, many of them are like in a deadlock, because they think if they ask for more radical things and structural changes, many people are not going to support them. They are going to be attacked from both sides. And if they don't, they are sterile. They can't do much. The other thing I wanted to mention that has made this protest different from the previous ones is that it has happened in a very crucial time, the looming time of transition of power from Khomeini, who knows to whom. And so it is very, the regime is more vulnerable because of its economic situation. These young generation, just think of 3 million students that Iran has now, 6 million school pupils. These people need employment, need work. But the economy for the past 10 years has been declining and declining. 30% of per capita income, per capita income is down 30% now. So they see with this continuous hostile foreign policy, this ambition for nuclear arms, and they see a deadlock for the regime's future. So why then invest in this regime anymore? So, and then the illness of Ayatollah Khamenei on the one hand, and uncertainty of who is going to replace him and what kind of internal fight is going to begin, has further made the situation critical and this demonstrations more significant. I wanted to also say a few things about what we can learn from these protests. Not only we as scholars and advocates or activists of women's rights, but also people in other countries, especially in Western countries, especially feminists and human rights advocates who have been rather timid to support the voices of dissent and the protest movements in Iran. During the Green Movement, we saw how, let alone the governments, but even international support wasn't as much as we see now. And this support, fortunately, is coming from all sides, from people like Angela Davis, Noam Chomsky, Judith Butler, to philosophers and to government people and state people, but also from artists, from celebrities, from athletes, not only in Iran, but also internationally. We can learn that middle class matters. We are not just gonna wait until working class, everybody are joining the movement. This movement just by itself is important. The cause is important. After all, it has become hopefully realized by many people in Iran and outside that women's autonomy, women's choice, women's rights to have freedom of choice is intimately connected to the national sovereignty of people. After all, national sovereignty doesn't mean just sovereignty of the government. The regime in Iran always claims that we are independent. That is the achievement of this revolution, that now we are independent. What do we mean by independence, by sovereignty, when citizens don't have a right to really vote? The voting is a sham, increasingly rigged and manipulated and engineered. So we need to learn from Iranian feminists, their experience, their fearlessness, their courage, their brevity, and also understand fundamentalism more clearly. Let me just give a couple of slides.
Nayereh, I think
time
you're
is
at the
over?
end of your time.
Okay.
Perhaps you can save your other comments during the later discussion.
Okay.
Thank
Sure.
you very much. I have listed a fair number of topics that you have raised, but for the sake of time, I just wait till we have a common discussion and then probably bring some of those out. And as I'm sure the other panelists would. Next, I think we're going to move to Dr. Manijeh Moradian. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for being here, for tuning in to this conversation. So I want to focus on the question of, is this uprising a feminist revolution? And if so, what makes it so? And some of what I want to say has already been said, so I'll try to move through those points quickly. So as we know, we have large, diverse sections of Iranian society, secular and religious, from different ethnic and class backgrounds, who have come together around an understanding that compulsory hijab is central to the authoritarian practices of the state. And so this particular gendered form of Iranian nationalism has become the crystallization of all other grievances and injustices. Women, as previous speakers have said, have been leading the movement, especially young women, including high school girls. have been at the forefront of defying the government and demanding freedom from bodily regulation by the state. They have put their bodies on the line. They have danced in the streets around bonfires, burning headscarves, as Nahid showed us the video. They have shouted down government officials who dare to lecture them on proper hijab, and have created figures of fearlessness that have inspired others, including so many men. And I agree absolutely with Dr. Tohidi that is one of the most significant things that we see about this, this moment. But there is more that makes this revolution feminist in form and substance. And I want to say that I use that word revolution because the demand is to bring down the government, right? Whether they succeed or not, we don't know. But the demand is for an end to the Islamic Republic. It is a revolutionary demand. I want to draw on the recent analyses of an analysis of an Iranian woman writing under the pseudonym L from her home outside Tehran. In her stunning essay called, quote, "Figuring a Woman's Revolution, Bodies Interacting with Their Images," L argues that the protests are transforming women's relationships to their bodies, to each other, and to history. The essay was written in Persian during the first week of the uprising and then translated into English by Ali Reza Doustar, and you can read it on jedalia.com. I want to share a few key pieces of L's feminist analysis of what makes this revolution a feminist revolution. And really, the focus here is on the body as the site of desires or affective capacities that can be mobilized towards revolutionary ends. So L theorizes from her lived experience of first viewing images of the protests online. And as Nahid spoke about, the movement in some ways began on social media, right? That experience of first seeing images of protests and then joining them in the street. And she writes, quote, "The images we women have seen of other resisting women have granted us a new understanding of our bodies," end quote. Desire, she explains, is the driving force behind this movement, rather than a particular ideology or political platform. The desire to transform oneself into a figure of resistance. And I'm just going to quote again from this essay. "People, and especially women, these tenacious and headstrong seekers of their desires, are going after this new desire hard. And this same desire increasingly drives forward a chain, stimulating further desires to create figures and situations of resistance. I want to be that woman with the figure of resistance, the one I saw in the photo, and I create a figure. These figures were already present in the unconscious of the protesters without ever having been practiced, as though they had been practicing them for years. This figure of resistance, this body recorded in images, becomes, in later links of the stimulating chain of desires, an incitement of other women's desire to strike their own figures. Oh, what desires have been released during these days from the prison house of our bodies, we women," end quote. So L understands desire as a politicizing and a political force, generating a feminist revolt. The desire for a new relationship to one's body, the desire to be free of state repression, the desire to fight back when you are under attack. All of these desires were latent in the body as potential, a potential that was mobilized through an interaction between images and the body, the desire to embody a female figure of resistance. The body is here understood to be an archive of oppression and defiance, a reservoir of affective potential that is being oriented towards the transformation of society. In my own research on the Iranian diasporic anti-Shah movement, the left of that movement in the 60s and 70s, I describe the circulation of what I call revolutionary affects, the embodied remains of encounters with repression and resistance that were loaded with an indeterminate potential that can lay dormant or be channeled into various political and social directions depending on the context. Significantly, in the late 1970s, the revolutionary affects of many Iranian students, including those who were abroad, attached to various strains of third world Marxism, fueling a student movement that included many women, yet sought to incorporate them into a masculinist version of revolutionary change. At that time, the revolutionary affects of the vast majority of women and men who were active against the Shah did not attach to issues of gender and sexual freedom, bodily autonomy, or feminism. Quite the opposite, in fact. These concepts, these ideas were too often dismissed as bourgeois or Western, or deferred until after the so-called primary struggle against imperialism had been won. Now, however, we see the accumulated experiences of the last 4 decades have reorganized the priorities. National sovereignty, of course, matters, but so does the ability to live and love and thrive within the nation. These things, as Dr. Tohidi was just saying, should not be counterposed. I'm reminded of the Black feminist Combahee River Collective statement, which says that in order for Black women to be free, we would all have to be free because we would have to dismantle all of the structures of oppression in US society. So I think what we're seeing in this movement is a kind of recognition that for Kurdish women like Mahsa Jina Amini to be free, patriarchy, ethnic and religious oppression, class oppression would all have to be dismantled. It's become a movement that can hold all of that, right? So we're talking about a capacious form of feminism as a politics of human liberation. And I just want to add that there is no room, I don't believe, for foreign interventions within that vision. The focus on desire and the body in L's analysis also pushes us to expand the conversation about what makes the revolution feminist to issues of sex and sexuality, which are, of course, crucial feminist concerns. It is no coincidence that the regime, in its efforts to discredit the protesters, accuses young people leading this struggle of protesting simply because they want to sleep with a different person every night. You can see here how sex and sexuality and the need to govern and control it, this is such a site of threat, right, to the government. Non-normative sex, by which I mean any sex outside of heterosexual marriage, is criminalized in the Islamic Republic. Sex and also sexuality are inseparable from the desire to be free of compulsory hijab, because this is fundamentally about overcoming a state-imposed alienation from one's own body. And I think that's something that women in particular experience, but I agree that that it's also an oppressive, that the context of this kind of patriarchal state regulation of bodies, of sex and sexuality is also very oppressive for men as well. Dancing around the bonfire, returning the punches of the police, all of this and more express that desire to be free from, as the line says in the Baraye anthem that Professor Siamdoust talked about in the beginning, the desire to be free from the fear when kissing, right? And to inhabit the body, in particular the female body, the non-binary body, the queer body, and trans body as sites of pleasure and joy rather than shame and fear. We see this desire manifest in diaspora, where chants of queer freedom and trans freedom have also been central to some of these protests, in particular to the International Day of Feminist Solidarity on October 2nd, where openly queer, non-binary, and trans Iranians were visibly leading many of those marches and rallies. The revolutionary affects attached to each image of women resisting have cracked open history to reveal new subjects of change, or rather to call those subjects into being. As L writes, quote, "This imprisoned time in a photograph makes a linear narrative of history problematic and highlights in its stead a topology of the situation, the gestures, the moments, and the micro struggle that we have been fighting every day. #4, that moment and all those moments. Not for that general narrative, but for everything small, for those fleeting micro moments, for taking them back, for that lump in the throat, for that fear, for that excitement, for that word, for that instant that continues till now, that has dragged itself to today, concealed itself under our skin, beneath our nails, in the lump of our throats. The present perfect. The time of the photographs is the present perfect. It arouses desires, brings the past to life, extends it until a second ago, and in the moment of now, it hands the marathon of instants over to the next moment, the next photo, and the next figure," end quote. So I think this is a kind of feminist theorization of how the movement grows and spreads outwards from the body into a social and political revolutionary force imbued with a desire that cannot be disciplined by any pre-existing ideology. The body does what once felt impossible, risks everything, even life itself. And we see how much violence the Iranian government has been willing to unleash. Invasions of universities, raids of high school, of girls' high schools, military-style crackdowns in Kurdistan, Baluchistan, even arresting and killing children, right? So in this moment, there is an urgent need for those of us in diaspora, I believe, to build solidarity from below, to construct a new feminist internationalism that can learn from and support this effort to create another very different Iranian revolution. And I think that really means understanding the specificity of the Iranian context, uplifting the particular experiences and voices and demands of people there, and then trying to actually make connections to feminist and other liberation movements in other parts of the world without collapsing that specificity or imposing frameworks from other societies onto the Iranian context. I think, in fact, there's tremendous potential to do that right now. And I hope that perhaps in the conversation that follows, we can talk a little bit more about the potentials and, of course, some of the challenges of doing transnational feminist solidarity and building that internationalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moradian, for many of the remarkable points that you have raised. And so far, actually, I think the progression of this panel works perfect in the sense that now we see various aspects of it. And now probably is the time to move on. Thank you very much for also ending on time. To move on to Dr. Sohrabi, Naghmeh Sohrabi, who would like to share with us, perhaps again, like Elle that you have mentioned, the person who corresponded with you and provided you with this remarkable insight, perhaps another insight that we're going to have as well. Dr. Sohrabi, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just want to first add my thanks to what came before me for both the invitation and the organization and all the logistical help, but particularly because it's always such a joy to be with Nahid, Manijeh, and Nayereh, and of course, Abbas, as I was told to call him. And it's coming in last is both intimidating after you've had such presentations, but also it allows me to kind of build up on what has come before. And I really appreciate how thorough and how wonderful the analysis has been so far. So for the past several years, I've been thinking a lot about the experiences of the Iranian revolutionary generation of 1979 for a book that I'm writing. As an historian, what I'm interested in understanding is what it felt like to live through the 1970s for those who were politically active, and even for those who weren't, before this tsunami called a revolution was visible on one's horizon. What this means is that my focus is often on the push and pull between the tidiness of historical narratives and the messiness of the actual event of a revolution itself. I focus also on generational experience, a word that we've heard a lot, and about the ways in which the ordinary in 1979 was often nestled within the extraordinary. As such, you would think that I'm extremely well prepared to say something cogent and meaningful about the events in Iran today. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I increasingly find myself unable, or rather hesitant, to do so. Some of my hesitance has to do with the fact that conditions of knowledge production have a sharp effect on the questions being asked and answered about revolutionary movements. In the case of the protests in Iran today, it is hard for me to ignore who I am, someone who has not visited Iran in over 15 years and has not lived in it for about 40. And not wonder about the degree to which the diasporic condition, and I'm just going to put all my cards on the table, my wishful thinking, is shaping my analysis of events today. This would not in and of itself be a major problem if what we know today was not almost entirely mediated through social media and family networks. I've been rather awestruck by how quickly and how efficiently news of events inside Iran have reached us outside. So my issue is not that, but rather the issue is what is lost in this mediated knowledge, which brings me to the second part of my hesitance, namely how, if at all, we can capture just not what the events are, but also what they mean and what is experienced, both by those in the streets and those who have remained at home, both action and inaction. Our mediated understanding of the protests, coming as they are primarily through social media, which are by nature built to heighten experiences and sensations, cannot almost by nature convey the ordinary, nor the ways in which the ordinary shapes and constitutes revolutionary action. Which brings me to the third element of my hesitancy, the generational question that has so beautifully been talked about so far. Revolutionary movements, almost always in their most precarious stages, are led by young people. While along with everyone else, I am in awe of the young women and the men out in the streets risking everything for a chance at freedom, I'm also quizzical about where the other generations are, particularly my generation, the parents of these youths in revolt. This is a generation that came into young adulthood in the first decade after the revolution. It remembers not just the revolution itself, but the violence of post-revolutionary state formation, both in the bloody power struggle of the early 80s and in the bloodshed and deprivations that was the 8-year war with Iraq. It's a crucial generation for understanding the potential for these protests to expand, a question that in many ways intersects with the puzzle of middle-class participation. I grew up in Iran in the 1980s. Almost all of my former classmates in Iran remained silent on Twitter and Facebook, and only exchanged news of both the ordinary and the extraordinary in the semi-private spaces of WhatsApp and Telegram. One of them, whom I've known since we were 10 years old, articulated in our WhatsApp group the shame she felt from, on the one hand, wanting to support the young people in the streets, and on the other, feeling paralyzed by a fear she understood to be twinned to our generation. She articulated thoughts and emotions that were not binary, and yet seemed crucial to understanding the situation in Iran today. So I asked her if she would like to address you in my stead today. She is 50, she's a medical professional, and a mother of 2 young women. What follows is my translation of what she has written for us for this event. And now I'm going to shift to her. She asked me not to use her name. It's a good thing that you can't easily understand the experience of living under the shadow of a religious dictatorship. I'm personally happy about this, even if 4 decades of my life have unfolded within that experience. At the time of the revolution, I was a 7-year-old girl who spent a carefree, childish life in my simple family. Exactly on the night of February 11, 1979, which is the date of the revolution, all that had seemed simple became very complicated. All the concepts and values turned on their heads, and life stopped as if someone pulled the emergency brakes of a train. The changes that came into the lives of us ordinary people came slowly but continuously. And the first effects of it were, I think, not just for me, but for everyone, that we all fell down the hole of a strange politicized world. Political struggles, conspiracies, and machinations were so close and so constant that elementary school kids in the recess, instead of doing what kids their age usually do throughout the world, were thinking of politics and arguing politics. These endless arguments continued in taxis, in homes, in streets, and elsewhere. It didn't matter how old we were. Our world suddenly was focused on one thing, the government that wanted to be everything to us. Our fathers, our mothers, our religion, our country, everything. For many, this seemed comforting, but there were also those who felt they didn't want someone else to think for them in the hours of their solitude. Some people wanted to be themselves and by themselves when they were alone. Yet this slowly became impossible. That God of whom people would speak to within themselves and in the dark, and who was sometimes kind and sometimes indifferent, had suddenly gathered an army for itself and was willing to take you prisoner for just having a thought. Not immediately, but the possibility always loomed. As the years went by, the presence of that third person in the quiet and solitude of people became so strong that it was as if a twin made of fear had been nailed to our soul. Despite this all, we lived much like you. We fell in love, we got married, we gave birth to children, we went to work, we argued. And of course, everywhere we went, we carried with us our terrifying twin. For people looking at us from the outside, things seem normal. Many would ask, how do these people seem content? How do these people seem happy? But no one could see the shadow we carried with ourselves. No one understands the red lines that maniacally move around, these agitated lines that can, in a short time, turn each of us into a criminal without us having to even take a step. Maybe it's hard to believe that the field of written and unwritten laws could be so vast and so open to interpretation that it can be used to prove all Iranians are criminals. And maybe it's hard to believe we are the kind of people who, even as the possibility of becoming criminals any moment hangs over our heads, can happily go and eat ice cream on the streets. For me, who has lived for half a century and more than 4 decades under these circumstances, life sometimes becomes very complicated. In these years, many times I went along with every reformist wave in the hopes that I could change something, or at the very least open a window. I would look at my 2 daughters and think, I need to try for them. At home, with my motherly whispers, I raised them to be free. I even told my children about those political arguments we had when we were children, those never-ending arguments. I created freedoms for them that I had never had, and opened pathways for them that I hadn't even known to exist when I had been their age. Even as these memories seeped into the dark corners of my mind, I tried to turn my children away from seeing the darkness. Instead, I showed them every door that would let in the light of the future. I separated the meaning of Vatan from the Islamic Republic and told them over and over again that I'm in love with every hill and every stream in this country. In return, what I got were the inquisitive eyes of my now 20 and 14-year-old daughters who would ask, you still have hope for this country? Times like this is also when they teach me about thousands of other worlds through their illuminated cell phone screens, connected as they are to the world online. And they show me what worlds there are unknown to us. The 3 of us put our heads together to see things on this tiny screen. I learned to not be, and from them, I learned to not be homophobic. I learned to not be racist. I learned what democracy can be. And I even learned that all these years, I haven't been applying makeup correctly. The 3 of us are growing up together. This new generation whose awareness far outpaces their parents and has always had this ever bright and active window called the internet onto the world are very different than me and us. With all their surface confusion and carelessness, they believe in the righteousness of their demands. Each of them carries their own respectful God within them and knows the power of the collective. They've been doing democratic drills on social networks and understand what a verbal back and forth looks like and are not scared to pay the price for it. Unlike my generation, who thought the world has to be made from colored candy and believe that there's an ideal human, an ideal government, and even an ideal God, this generation knows none of that exists. What does exist is a path towards the future that leaves behind everything and everyone. And now I'm left with the fears that have been nailed to my soul and a generation that I cannot stop, and all that has happened in Iran after the death of Mahsa. Me and others in my generation are the fearful ones, living with a deep hatred and an ancient fury. For years, we've been humiliated, and with every move we make, we sink deeper into our humiliation. When we look at these kids, this youth, we're ready to jump on the train of the social movement, but we're not ready to share in its defeat or its despair. Our bitter experiences have made us more cautious. In the street, I look at these young women with disbelief. at their beautiful hair, their luminous faces, and at their extraordinary courage. And I want to break out of this skin of fear and go amongst them and cry out. I go along with them for a short while. I can be at the forefront for a bit. I can be like a mother and take them in my arms, but I remain hesitant. I remain scared, and I remain in disbelief. Every day I think, what if a revolution happens and we, this generation that has buried a galaxy of hatred within us, miss the chance to cry out? Maybe we need another push so that my generation, the middle-aged passive generation, would step foot onto the streets and release our besieged souls instead of making jokes about our misery and exchanging the same old arguments in virtual spaces. My kids ask me, Mom, was this what the revolution was like? I think of my memories when I was 7 and the sound of tanks and the sound of bullets and the chaos of the city and official papers flying in the wind. And I say, no, it's still not like that. The walls of the streets are not yet filled with slogans, and people, when they look at each other, still don't smile. But every night at exactly 9 p.m., my kids turn off the lights and say to me, go say it. I slowly walk to our balcony and I sit on a small stool in a corner. And with all my might and for all my pent-up suffering, painful trauma, and unshed tears, I shout, death to the dictator. And of course, I don't let my kids go out into the streets, because if there's a bullet coming, it should come from me, not for the generation of the future. Thank you.
Abbas, you're muted.
Thank you so much. I was going to say thank you very much for this extremely moving finale to our panel, which to presentations. We still have a time for discussion. And indeed, I think it shows that how well-rounded is the group of presentations that we had to give us such a wonderful picture. And I think what we have among us doesn't need my further comments and gives us a chance to raise questions and start a conversation. So I have made some points, but I actually saved them, if need be, to bring them up. So that's a time for our panelists to ask questions, make comments, or in certain respect to commensurate with what we've heard all around. Perhaps, I don't know, Nayereh, would you like to start asking some questions, or Nahid? Is there something that you would like to say, or would you like me to raise some questions?
I prefer you to raise a question or two.
Well, okay. Perhaps the first point, which was very striking for me in his presentation, is this level of maturity that you see among these very young people. These are at least those that we have access to. And indeed, it's maturity all round, because what Naghmeh presented also shows a tremendous degree, or what Elle anonymously has written and we've heard, would give us that we are dealing with a generation, or with a time and generations, that have a really remarkable understanding of what they want, and in a sense puts people from the outside into a moment of questioning what we have been thinking and what we have been saying, because that's happening over the past 40 years and resulted in the rise of this new generation. That was for me very remarkable. In Nayereh's presentation, I noticed this question of gender, this question of violating the family, basically this sanctity of the family environment. It's not only the young women, it's the families, which is also, I found very remarkable. There is a sense of sovereignty of the younger generation being again violated. In Manijeh's excellent presentation, I also sense this idea that there are many themes that are coming through that probably is not so visible for us when we get the news in just video clips and we see demonstrations. There's much more behind it in terms of particularly the question of sexuality, which I think is very remarkable. This is an area of deprivation that the Iranian society has faced for a very long time, even prior to the revolution of 1979, I say. And all through these decades, this seems to have been a complex that is now has reached a point of basically explosion. These younger generations have the courage to raise these questions that probably for the older generations, as we heard from Naghmeh, they hesitated and they basically found themselves cornered by the way that the course of the revolution of 1979 basically changed their lives and put them in a position that they could no longer have the kind of an agency that it requires to raise questions. And now, surprisingly, this new generation comes along, at least from what we see right now, to basically present something that earlier generations, I think at least two generations, their grandparents and their parents, were unable to do. I still sometimes, even when I look at some of these clips that we get in the social media or on the media outside Iran, is that women are protesting, they putting their lives online, and then people are passing by, and some of them don't pay much attention to what's going on. So this is another side of this, in my opinion, this kind of generational gap that probably others are thinking in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their security, and in basically dissociating themselves or detaching themselves from what they see, or at least to us, appears as something so crucial, so central to the future of Iran, or for that matter, the whole region, one might say, far beyond Iran. So that's what I would say. Now, if we would like to raise some particular points, it has been time and again pointed out that there is no program as far as what we see this movement is presenting, and obviously no leadership. Perhaps it's too early, it's too premature to ask these kinds of questions. And as a matter of fact, listening to our panelists, it seemed to me that indeed, yes, probably it is too premature to ask this kind of questions. But I would like first to have your thoughts about that. What do you think? Do you think that something would emerge in terms of a program of action? Something would emerge in terms of a leadership, and how they're going to interact with the current government in power, which, as I'm sure all of you would acknowledge, is tremendously powerful in many respects. Just look at this riot police in the streets of Tehran and how terrifying they are, and how well equipped. It is as though the Islamic Republic, the only area which they found they really invested is the riot police, and the way that they would like to control everything, with morality police and so on. So my question is that, do we see are we in a position to see a future for this movement? Nahid, let's start with you.
I mean, it's a very complicated question because because of the nature of this movement and what we've been referring to as this leaderless movement that is networked and intersectional and encompasses a large segment of the population. But among these, what we see a lot of sacrifice, especially from the younger generations, from the minorities, but we haven't really seen sort of a voice emerge and I don't think it's supposed to. And so I think this is sort of uncharted territory, and we shall all be very, surprised and educated by what might emerge. But I just, I don't think we can apply our previous understandings of how revolutions work necessarily to this particular revolution. I really liked how, Naghmeh's friends narrative about how she's learning from her daughters and how she, because of the feeling of guilt that she has for having brought about she was a child herself at the time of the revolution. Surely she was not responsible for the Islamic Republic, but at the same time, wanting to take that bullet, but not having not embodying the presence and the subjectivity that it can bear to put herself out there, where her young daughters are putting her out on the balcony and encouraging her to say this protest slogan, to call for the downfall of Khomeini. All to say, I'm sorry, I'm learning myself. And I just think that, what we see is that the leaders that have, sort of leaders of certain segments that we have seen, for example, let's say the royalists or whoever, none of them have been able to take to become spokesperson or take leadership for what's happening in Iran, right? None of them really. This is something that has taken everybody by surprise, because the leaders are the youngest generation of Iran's population who are saying, we are willing to risk everything because the future we're seeing is not worth living. And so what kind of leader does that produce? I would love to pass this down to my co-panelists.
Yes. Perhaps Nayereh, given your, witnessing the revolution of 1979 and its aftermath, what do you have to say with what we see right now?
Going back to Naghmeh's, the letter Naghmeh read, which was so realistic in the way that person is talking about her, honestly about her hesitance and fear and all that. I think we when as a young student experienced the 1979 revolution, I had the same experience with my parents. They wouldn't join the demonstrations. They would be very cynical at times that mullahs are coming to, especially my father. Given that I am from a family that both my grandfathers were cleric, and my father was disowned by his father for taking off his turban and defrocking himself because he got very disillusioned with the Rouhaniyat, with clerics in Iran, and was very cynical. So from very early on, he would tell us that these people are wasting their life for nothing. We are going to go back 100 years backward if Khomeini comes to power. So they never joined the demonstrations, neither my mother nor my father. And they took pride after, when we got in prison, not me, my siblings. He kept saying, I told you this, you didn't listen to me. So in other words, but there were other parents who joined among our relatives and friends, joined demonstrations after a while. Maybe it is too soon now for middle-aged and older people, although we see some of them on the streets, but not many. Still, it is, for the most part, younger people. The other thing I could mention is about your question about the future. As Nayereh says, it's really hard to predict, especially since this is really a leaderless movement so far, but it has its own type of internet-related Z generations type of leadership and networks and all that. But as I said, regardless of what happens to this movement, there has been already a paradigm shift in the subjectivity of Iranian activists, at least men and women. For the first time, they are understanding importance of self-autonomy that is so connected to the national autonomy and sovereignty. And they are not buying all this, wait until, don't say anything, don't complain, the imperialism is going to take advantage of it, don't talk about Islamic fundamentalism, it perpetuates Islamophobia. They don't care anymore about these cautionary and fearful attitudes. They're saying, we can't wait until everything is, when is the right time to talk about women's rights? You always say, the left, I remember when I was a student, I was told that don't talk about feminism, that's a deviation from the right path to socialism. When we have socialism, then everything is going to be dandy and resolved, no more women's oppression and so forth. But there were also many, not in Iran, unfortunately, not that many that I could talk with, but outside who had experience living in, for example, Soviet Union, they could better understand that, no, we can't wait. Or feminists like Simone de Beauvoir, who was initially saying that I'm not a feminist, but after a while, she said, I should admit that I am a feminist and I really value women's movement. We can't wait until capitalism is gone or this authoritarian government is gone and so forth. These are the things I think our younger generations have already learned better than us. They're saying, I'm not going to wait for anything. I want my rights right now. And about what is going to happen with regard to the suppression of this movement, let me just end
Dr. Tohidi, we have limited time.
Okay.
Please,
can I read a quotation about like some prediction or whatever about this, whether this regime is going to be able to suppress this movement or not. I'm quoting from Robin Wright. She aptly says that the regime may still have enough cruel tools and stormtroopers to contain the protests, but utopian ideologies tend to collapse when a confluence of factors, that is political alienation, economic woes, societal fury, and nature's disasters coincide. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Before we go any further, I would like to ask Dr. Zadeh whether we would be able to extend another 15 minutes.
Yeah, yes, I think
given the fact that you have 27 questions.
Right, and certainly we won't be able to address all the questions, but I think just given the nature of the conversation, it would make sense to continue on. And I do see that if it's okay, I do see some of our panelists are wanting to respond also they have their hands up here.
Yeah,
Sure.
I just wanted to just add one thing because it was raised just to clarify. I think the point that this person who I read her piece was trying to get across, in addition to all the other wonderful points, for me at least, what was important is that I think we have a tendency to think the revolution happened, and then we're in this moment. As if the 40 odd years between the revolution and now didn't happen. The most that we have so far in our analyses given mentioned, not us today, I mean in the wider general public, this is much more sophisticated than that, is we'll talk about the Green Movement, we'll talk about 2019, we'll talk about these flashpoints. And I think one of the most important takeaways of this person who asked me to read this piece is the way in which the 40 odd years of the Islamic Republic's history, beyond our usual repression, was influential in creating generations. And that creation then has an effect on where we are today. I think my most important takeaway of what she says is not about the revolution, it's about the war. And it's about the repression of the early post-revolutionary years that has forged a generation in a kind of fear that later generations did not have, and that created a kind of future and hope in the reform movement, which was a crucial flashpoint for that generation. And that has led to them being at the moment, asking them the questions, and also raising the children that they are today. And I kind of thought I didn't want that point to get lost, about that the history is not just about repression, about what happened with the revolution, what were the protests before, but the actual history itself, what happened and how different generations were forged in these webs of politics, economics, social and cultural.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Manijeh. Would you like to add something?
Sure. I mean, this is, none of us know what's going to happen. Many of the questions are like, what's going to happen? And I mean, we don't know, just to be clear, none of us know what's going to happen. But what we do know is that, coming out of the Iranian Revolution, and especially after the end of the war, there have been many different movements in Iran. As Naghmeh was just saying, it hasn't just been repression. There's been a lot of organizing and a lot of resistance and a lot of struggle. There's been a workers' movement. There's been a student movement. There's been many iterations of women's movements, right, that have tried many strategies and tactics, working within parliament, working within courts, working to reform laws, right? There have been working to change many different aspects of society, right? And pushing in different ways for more and more rights every chance people got, and they've had successes in different moments, and there's been a lot of repression, and there's been a backlash. And the current composition of the Iranian government is a hardliner consolidation, right? And that is what people are up against. And you don't emerge from decades of sort of trying and getting crushed with suddenly a political platform and leaders and parties and institutions, because none of those were allowed to follow their own course of development, right? They were shut down. And so I think this is a moment where, there's not a roadmap, right? Without ideology, without parties, without institutions, without leaders, people are nonetheless trying to forge a new path. They have been told, their whole lives that you have two choices. It's either Western domination or the Islamic Republic. That's it. And there is a rejection, I think, of that binary. I don't think the majority of people on the streets of Iran want to become a neo-colony of the US, nor do they want to be dominated by a religious dictatorship. And I think that they have the right to try for something new, something unprecedented, something that they themselves don't yet know what it might be. And what my hope is that we will continue to see new forces, new groups enter the scene that will give the movement new momentum and broaden it and deepen it further. For example, I think it's still quite small, but we see one group of petrochemical workers have gone on strike. Will that spread to the entire industry? Will it last long enough to have a real impact on the government? Will there be mass defections from the armed forces? That is one of the characteristics of revolutions, right? That at a certain point, many people in uniform decide they refuse to carry out orders, to fire on the people who they identify with more than the people giving the orders. Will that dynamic, enter the scene? We don't yet know. And I think it's been 24 days, right? And so I think from where I sit here in the United States, my biggest concern is how do we uplift their voices, but also keep the attention on what's happening so that the government, perhaps thinks twice about unleashing even more massive brutality than they already have. Can we exert international pressure, from below to mitigate some of what they think they can get away with? But also, and I know this is not something that a lot of people want to talk about right now, but because I'm in the United States, I feel I have an ethical obligation to say, to prevent my government, the United States government, from interfering, to allow Iranian people to have as much space and time as possible to figure out what they want for themselves, to actually have the right to self-determination, not as it's defined by the Islamic Republic, but as people themselves are figuring it out day by day as they go. So I think that question of international solidarity for me becomes central. And just briefly, because I saw some questions about this, I agree that there has been somewhat of a deafening silence from some sectors of the US left and feminists in Western countries. Now, I can't speak for individuals or, tell you exactly what everybody's thinking, but I do have some hunches about what I think some of the problems may be. I think one is that there is a version of leftist anti-imperialism in the West that is singularly focused on opposing the actions of the US government and cannot recognize that there are other sources of oppression in the world that are just as damaging and destructive depending on where you sit. And that in fact, there's, we talk a lot about intersectionality of identity and of struggle, but there's also an intersection in terms of how these forces of repression function. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Trump presidency, the end of the deal, maximum pressure sanctions, ushers in an even more hardline reactionary government in Iran than anything we've seen, in a long time. So I think there's a relationship between US imperialism and actually emboldening the most reactionary forces within Iran, further. So I think that there's a problem of some US leftists or some Western leftists who do not have the ability to recognize these dynamics and these intersections. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think for a lot of feminists in the West, they have rightly spent a lot of time opposing Islamophobia, destigmatizing things like hijab, trying to challenge the idea that Muslim women are submissive and passive and inherently oppressed by their religion and by, Islamic, covering, right? And that's been really important work given the context that we live in. At the same time, it does not account for the lived experience and history of women in Iran, where hijab is not an individual expression of your faith, which must be defended, but is a state-imposed authoritarian structure backed up by violence from the state, right? And that whole experience, there hasn't been a lot of space for that. That's kind of been erased, right? And I think there's a challenge now to be able to reckon with, that lived reality and the image of Iranian women burning their hijabs because of the enforced mandatory nature of hijab, right? And that, as somebody said earlier, some of the women protesting are wearing hijab, right? That this is not a movement against women who wear hijab, right? And so I don't think there's a contradiction between opposing Islamophobia, defending people's rights to express their religion and their faith as they want to, and being in full solidarity with a movement against a religious dictatorship, right, that tries to force its particular version of Islam onto women's bodies with the threat of state violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all this very remarkable in-depth insight into what's going on in today's Iran. From what I've heard here, one thing that I can say for sure that this is a new experience. Of course, we can always argue from the perspective of historian, our revolutions have peculiarities of their own. But this is indeed not only a question for the people of Iran, for the older generations, but worldwide. The fact that the left, as you have very cogently pointed out, has faced new issues with regard to the demands of the younger Iranian people. And so does actually probably feminists in general, that they are facing with the circumstances that they have not expected coming out of a place like the Islamic Republic. And that is, I think, perhaps the most, in my opinion, exhilarating, that whatever the outcome of this, and I would very much hope the outcome of it is going to be positive, it's going to be nonviolent, and I very much hope that this regime is not going to unleash further violence towards the demonstrators. But whatever the outcome of it would be, I think this is definitely a turning point, as it was pointed out by Dr. Tohidi. I don't know, Travis, would you like to take some of the questions, please?
Yes, I mean, there's been such a wellspring of responses from the audience. I just want to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge the tenor of those questions and responses. As Professor Moradian noted, a good number are interested in kind of moving forward the kind of practical ways of international solidarity, but also organization and kind of reflections on where to go next at a practical level, and then a whole variety of just comments. And I want to just echo these about how meaningful this conversation is and how significant this space that we're holding is. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. In terms of the actual questions, I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them. They're here in on the side here. Some are very much, as I said, oriented around practical suggestions about going forward, and some about the generational questions that many of us brought up. I think the historical thinking back about how this compares to other revolutions in Iran and other protest movements, I think that would be something to reflect on, perhaps more broadly as well. And it's hard to say, as Professor Moradian just noted, we're just not even a month into these events. But I don't know if there's a space to be able to reflect here, perhaps on that question about comparison with other movements from a historical vantage. I could just pose that broadly here. How does this measure up? I mean, I think several of you have commented upon it in different ways, but yes, I'll just pose it there. How do we think about this at this stage with respect to other protest movements within Iran?
Well, if I can put my 2 cents as a historian into this debate, there is a famous book about anatomy of a revolution that all historians would think that it's almost obligatory for the history students to read it, by Benton, in which he argues that there are stages to revolutions, and no two revolutions are the same, so much that he had tried to come up with the kind of anatomy for all the revolutions. So we really don't know, but we are at the very early stages, as it was pointed out. And but the issues that it's really touching upon, particularly the issue of hijab, which has now a very different resonance that what often has been understood among the liberals in the West, that we are dealing with a new issue concerning hijab. That, I think, is a very remarkable beginning, because it contrasts very much for what as it was pointed out in several of our presentations, by the regime in Iran, by the Islamic government. If you want to call the 2 pillars, ideological pillars of the Islamic revolution and Islamic government in power, one is the hijab. As far as the domestic issues are concerned, this is the means of control of the domestic of the population, and the other one, in my perspective, is death to America. or this kind of a slogan, meaningless, almost empty, kind of creating some kind of a hostile other, dushman, that is what it is. And basically both those two pillars are now being trembling, and I think both inside the regime and outside the regime, that becomes much more evident. The fact that it's so empty, the kind of 4 decades of propaganda that we are hearing from the Islamic government reaches a stage of crisis right now. So because of that, because this issue, certainly the issue of hijab, is so central to the regime, I think the fact that it has been now questioned, the fact that it's been so openly challenged by a younger generation is something that, it was pointed out, no longer can be ignored. What by the regime, what they can do with it remains to be seen, because I presume this raises many questions among the greatest supporters of the regime right now.
Would others like to add to that? Others of our panelists, kind of reflections as I think we should probably move to wrap up in light of the time, but other last reflections on. I mean, I actually appreciate the not only this historical perspective, but also the situation of our own conversation and the ethical implications, and with it the challenges in this diasporic kind of situatedness, and speaking from afar, and how attuned our panelists have been to our own locations, and in enunciating and reflecting on what's transpiring, and these stages of mediated knowledge as well. But I'd love to hear more about that. I know that this came up from several of you in our own kind of knowing the situation, witnessing it, bearing witness to it, but also in all these mediated forms.
Maybe I can just make a couple comments. One about the slogan. I mean, the sort of the some of the core elements of the Islamic Republic. There's in fact been a slogan about that, right? دروغ میگن آمریکاست، دشمن ما همینجاست. They're lying that it's America. Our enemy is right here. And the hijab. And I guess the comment I wanted to make was that, and the question was posed about this, comparing this movement to other movements in post-revolutionary Iran. And when we look at the 2009 Green Uprising, really, people were still drawing on some of the same slogans of the 1979 revolution, Islamic slogans, really trying to claim, making justice claims rooted within Islamic discourse, and going to their rooftops and calling Allahu Akbar, and so on. And all of that is really out the window. We don't see any religious slogans chanted anymore. So the Islamic Republic has sort of, run its course. And I also wanted to make the comment that, with 9/11 and America's invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and, its neo-imperial sort of policies in the region, it really didn't, leave Iranians much space to sort of reckon with their own situation at home, in part because they were taking up a stance against this sort of neoliberal power that at any moment might have attacked Iran. And the issue of attacking Iran was for many years on the table after Iraq. And so, what we see is sort of this movement for reforms having happened, and people having tried through reforms to change the system from within, trying to kind of claim what they had claimed at the time of the 1979 revolution, which is why we saw so many slogans sort of, recycled in 2009. We don't see any of that anymore, right? In the songs, in the slogans, there's no Shajarian to say, lay down your gun, let's have compromise. In fact, the people who are intoning the slogans of the 1979 revolution, they are taking the radical ones. So they're intoning Shajarian's song, take up your gun and let's get going. And instead of referring to barodar gharq khune, they're saying khohar gharq khune, right? It's the sister who is now right, swimming in blood. And so what's been interesting is to see sort of this maturation of this discourse coming around 40 some years after the revolution, and the disjuncture, disconnecting from this project of reforms, and necessarily tying this movement into a continuation of a project that started in 1979, and to sort of do away with it and say that happened and this is a breaking point. I think we very much see that in the slogans.
I think it's upon us as a group to at least look at all these questions that has been raised, many of them very interesting as I'm just glancing at them. And perhaps, although I know that our panelists are very busy, but perhaps in their own time, perhaps they would like to pick and choose and respond to some of these questions. I think perhaps we are getting at the very end. Am I right, Dr. Zadeh? Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I do see. We could go through several of these questions. I do think we could put them into buckets too, around generational divides as well. I think Nahid, you just also spoke to very much how we could characterize these movements in different ways. To Abbas's point that no revolution is the same, as it were. I am cognizant of our panelists' time as well, but it is true there's been such an outpouring of positive response and questions, and so many questions have come our way. I could dish them up, or we could go, pick and choose. I mean, there's this wonderful, and it gets to almost at the theoretical point, Parisa Vaziri, about the question of, and this gets into the language at a high level, and certainly of what do we mean when we're talking about the demand for bodily autonomy, and the kind of within the context of broader feminist thought and Western epistemologies. That perhaps goes to maybe Professor Moradian. I don't know if you want to take that up.
Or Dr. Tohidi,
yeah, Dr. Tohidi as well. I mean, honestly,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I do feel like it's a really important question and a much longer conversation
Yes.
than we can entirely, have right now. But I think that what's been interesting for me is some of the resonance that demand. Like, one of the ways that I think some transnational feminist solidarity has begun to happen is actually the resonance of that demand for bodily autonomy, right? So, I mean, we can get into sort of critiques of the, agency and the subject and the individual and all of those things, and critiques of the universal, critiques of secularism. There's a lot of issues coming out of this movement in Iran that there have been big debates around, right? Among, cultural studies and scholars, feminist, theorists for a long time now. So a lot of that has to be unpacked and teased out. But one of the resonances that I see, that I think disrupts the hierarchy that's sort of been there for so long between supposedly liberated women in the West and then the oppressed Muslim woman over there, is this issue of bodily autonomy. Because, in the United States, we have lost the right, to abortion. And there's an active movement in this country against patriarchal state oppression and domination over women's bodies right here. So we know American women are not liberated and free. In fact, we're involved in a life and death struggle to control our own bodies right here. And so, I think there's the potential for people to actually understand each other as peers rather than in a kind of civilizational hierarchy, right? That's been so destructive to the possibilities of real transnational feminist solidarity, but to actually see resonances, even though the contexts are different. I mean, we haven't even talked about what reproductive justice looks like in Iran and how many rights have been lost around that and the kind of backslide around that as well. So I do think the issue of bodily autonomy, while it's a longer conversation about those terms, and there are important critiques of that have been made that we need to engage with in this new reality, I also think that it's a potential site of really reconfiguring what transnational feminist solidarity can look like.
Just maybe a couple of points here, if we have time. I think some of these issues are universal, and I'm not scared of thinking that there are certain human rights that are universal. We are all human beings. Those who say it is relative, the human rights principles are relatives, they are kind of otherizing or hierarchicizing the humanity in a different way, but it's very similar to, or a sort of Orientalism, to think that, for example, don't criticize genital mutilation, even don't call it genital mutilation, just call it female circumcision. No, it is genital mutilation, believe me, go look at those women who are suffering from it. And it affects not only their body, their sexuality, but also their overall health. So why shouldn't we criticize? Why we feminists have become so, the white feminists, because of this colonial past, have become now overtly cautious and kind of feeling guilty about saying anything about any other cultures or people from different countries, which is itself, again, not taking, kind of thinking that these people, maybe they can tolerate genital mutilation because it's part of their culture. That's itself otherizing and orientalizing the people from mostly Oriental, the Eastern part of the world. So that's one point, that now, for example, this demand and yearning for bodily autonomy, which fortunately has become part of the United Nations literature too. There are specific definition of what we mean by that and how we should protect it and observe it. But also this universality, as Manijeh, you so cogently said, we are now in kind of, we should have even more solidarity with American feminists that are facing retrenchment and regress in their rights, bodily rights, their reproductive rights. They are as important as assault on our freedom of choice. If it is freedom of choice for reproductive rights, we are suffering from even freedom of choice to what to wear. That is how much regulations, there is degree of regulations and oppression. So I'm not going to say that women in Iran have the same problems that women in America, but there are similarities, but there are also distinct differences. We don't have some of our basic rights in the legal system of Iran. We should be very clear and loud about it. Actually, to show that people in Iran are fighting for their human rights, for their dignity, is a credit to people, to Muslim people. Not all Muslims are not fundamentalists. Not all Muslims are against women's rights. So why should we be fearful about that? And one last point is that Naghmeh says that since we are living in diaspora, we haven't been in Iran, so it's very hard to understand a lot of things. True, but it doesn't remove our responsibility to show solidarity. When we see people are being killed, there is no mediated, knowledge about that. They are being killed. Parents are talking about how they are being forced to say that, oh, she was killed because of falling down from a stairs or something. We are hearing that. We can assess what is in the what is fake in social media, although not easy, sometimes really tricky, but it doesn't remove our responsibility. I know for a fact, I hear from my activist friends from Iran that how, and especially university students, that solidarity from outside, from our diaspora communities, from international communities are so important to them. It inspires them, it gives them more, warms their heart. So we should keep on, and I'm very impressed with the level of activism that in the diaspora we are seeing, and sense of solidarity, fortunately, that, look how many demonstrations with huge numbers, unprecedented among Iranian diaspora. And they have also agreed not to, impose their banners, their slogans, and one political group taking over. Fortunately, so far, I don't know what's going to happen next, but so far there has been good sense of ethnic solidarity, religious solidarity, trans these differences, gender solidarity, both inside Iran and outside. But what is going to happen, I don't know next.
Actually, picking up on that really quickly, if I may, it kind of intersects directly with a couple of questions around Mahsa Amini's Kurdish identity and issues of ethnic solidarity, and of course the slogan and its own kind of circulation and multiple meanings and valences that come with it. I'd be curious if the panelists would like to speak about these various sectarian, ethnic dimensions as well that feed into, or that are in the undergirding in some fashion what's going on right now.
Before we would answer to this, Dr. Zadeh, it seems that at least two of our panelists think that they have to leave fairly soon. So it should be the last question.
Yes, it's the last. No, and I right, and then sure, and then I'll say a few words, but before they go, so maybe we make it very brief. I'm sorry, I want to be very mindful.
Sure, yeah. Yes. Anybody would like to comment on that? The question of ethnicity. Well, one thing appears to me, speaking of the brutality of the morality police and the regime in general, is that probably they have realized that she's from Kurdistan and the Sunni. And that may have played a part in the way that they have treated her. So that may be very hard to believe, but in my opinion, that may be part of the reason why she suffered all the blows and eventually lost her life. The fact that this, in the view of the regime, these ethnicities and this Shi'i-Sunni factionalism still is very much alive. And also, while we are on that point, I don't think we should ignore the fact that the regime in power may have lost some of its confidence, but it has an army of supporters. They have managed to social engineer a support for themselves. I mean, in today's Iran, there are 80,000 madda, and these are on government's pay or supported in one way or another, and so on. And also there is a sector of the women population that are so hostile to any kind of a liberalization in Iranian society. I see that Manijeh has raised her hand.
Just quickly on the question of the significance of Amini being Kurdish, I think that what it meant, because we mustn't forget that the protests started there in her hometown and spread to Kurdish cities first, and the slogan "Women, Life, Freedom" is a Kurdish slogan from the PKK, which has had an explicitly feminist liberation politics for at least a decade. And so from the beginning, the movement was imbued with the momentum of the Kurdish feminist inflected freedom struggle. Mm-hmm. And that was there from the beginning, right? And it caught like wildfire, I think, because of what we've already talked about, right? All of this embodied desire for freedom, right? That's been manifesting in various ways over time that could ignite in that moment. But I think we can't underestimate the way this movement was shaped from the beginning with a certain kind of feminist politics that come out of the Kurdish experience.
I think at that I should probably, in mindful of how where we are in time and our panelists' other commitments and lives, that we should probably bring this very rich, overflowing conversation, overflowing with so many thoughts and reflections and feelings as well, a very complex set of reflections, nuanced reflections, to a close. I want to thank so much our panelists for holding this space here tonight together on this Zoom conversation, and to our audience for all these very engaged questions and reflections, and again, emotive overflowing of response. It is such a heartening and troubling a set of experiences to witness and to confront. And I just want to thank all of you for being here and being together to discuss this and try to make sense of what we're witnessing collectively here. I wanted to also acknowledge several of you asked, would this event be recorded, and it is going to be recorded, and we're going to be putting it up on the Yale Council on Middle East Studies website, so it'll be available to be shared. And I want to again thank all of you for coming together and being in conversation this evening. I think at that, because I'm yes.
Can we get the questions that have been asked? Just a list of to know what questions were raised.
Yes, absolutely. I will be able to get those to you. I'm pretty sure Amara Kabur has the back end of the Zoom conversation under control. So I think we should be able to have access to that as a record as well. And I can share those with all of you. Thank you so much for your time and for joining in this conversation. It's been really a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you. And I wish you well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone. Great to be
Thank
with
you.
Thank you. Bye.